This podcast series is brought to you by NetZero, a food upcycler providing technology to feed the world better food with less resources, doing their part to reduce, recover, and reharvest food waste. You can find out more at netzro.us. And by the Upcycled Food Association, building a food system in which all food reaches its highest and best use. To learn more about becoming a member or to support the UFA by making a charitable donation, visit upcycledfood.org.
In the midst of what we are experiencing together as a global crisis and a food system crisis upon us, the one thing that I realized is that the people who have had the courage to jump in the arena and do upcycling or any kind of a food system disruption are still in the arena as of this morning. And I'm so moved by it that those of us who have been in it are not going to give up.
Too good to waste.
Too good to waste.
Way too good to waste.
Too good to waste, absolutely.
Hi, and welcome to the podcast series Too Good to Waste. I'm your host, Kevin May, and together we're going on an adventure to explore some of the fun and creative and innovative ways that lots of people are doing their part to help find a higher value in unused food and food byproducts that might otherwise be wasted. So thanks for joining me. Let's go see if we can find out about some of these things that are too good to waste.
Well, hey there. Welcome to this episode. It's episode number 2 of the podcast series, Too Good to Waste, and really thrilled you joined me. We've got a great guest lined up today. I may be a little bit biased, and you'll find out why here in just a moment. But before we go too far, I want to take just a moment and acknowledge where we are to kind of set the context of what's going on. It is April 8th of 2020, and while you might be listening to this tomorrow or today or the next day, you might actually be listening to it a month or a year from now. So just to set the scene, we're right in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis, and we're all sheltering in place. We're doing this particular broadcast here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and it's tough, challenging times for everybody. Absolutely no one is untouched by what's going on, and my heart goes out to all of you, especially in this particular arena, in the food arena, in the food justice arena. Everything is really being tested and being challenged right now, and my guest today will speak to that, and it's also a really big part of why this podcast series just got launched right now. So here's the inside scoop. Today's guest is Sue Marshall, who happens to also be my wife. I'm excited because I've been able to watch her develop this concept of net zero and food upcycling and really kind of changing the way, or being a part of this new food revolution, which really changes the way we look at what is perceived as food waste, but actually it's got a lot of value. So there's a big movement to try to take that and go to a zero waste model where literally nothing gets wasted. It's all upcycled in one form or another to find higher value. And there's lots of different ways that can happen, and I won't spoil it now. We'll get into that in the interview. But I want to just say that has been a big inspiration for me in not only watching Sue go through all she's gone through to build this company around this whole mission and vision, but also meeting so many different people at every single stop of the food supply chain, from farmers to brewers and distillers to chefs to bakers to millers. I mean, literally everybody that we've come in contact with is on board and wants to know, what can I do? And so that's been our inspiration for this podcast, and that's why we decided to launch it right now when things are at their toughest. This is when we all need to get together and do our part. And for you and me as the consumer, we have a lot of power. And throughout this series, you're going to be finding out more and more things that you can do and I can do to really make a difference. So that brings me to my guest today, which I'm very excited to feature her and to have the opportunity to interview my wife, Sue Marshall, the founder and CEO of NetZero, which is an upcycled ingredient company creating a new environmental and economic standard for reducing global food waste. Sue spends her days collaborating with others that also share her passion for economic and environmental sustainability while creating socially responsible initiatives. And she and I like to partner with Mother Nature to try to correct some of the mistakes of our generation and generations past so that the current and future generations can have it much better. Well, that sounds like a very tall order, an ambitious mission, and something that's very much needed right now. And I do know you have what it takes to make it a huge success, and you've been working really hard at this. Sue, it's my pleasure to have you on this show. Welcome.
Hello. Thanks for having me, Kevin.
So let's get started with a little bit of background on what got you interested in food waste and eventually into upcycling food byproducts. Where does that come from? How do you even get into something like that?
I was encouraged by my family and friends to go back and finish my graduate degree in 2013. I've been an entrepreneur my whole life, and majority of that time was in real estate up until that point in time. And as you can imagine, with the Great Recession and getting through that in real estate was an accomplishment in itself. But I was ready. I was ready to do something that I felt would be a more impactful at the next chapter of my life. So I went back to school, and I was really interested in any kind of thing that had to do with the land, what we were doing to the land. And that came from my real estate background, but I was really moved on waste, not thinking about the land. So I started studying everything from commercial composting, anaerobic digestion, food waste, and it led me in a path. And school was great. University of St. Thomas. I was in the entrepreneur side after a few classes. Of course, loved that. Didn't know what a pitch deck was. I was the kind of entrepreneur that you just jump into the arena. You don't pitch investors. And so the parts of it was a new world for me, and I really enjoyed it. And I had a lot of encouragement from the students there about food waste, and that was the start of everything. And here I am today in 2020, and I didn't even stop to think, oh my gosh, what I'm doing. I just did it. It was almost natural.
What do you think surprised you the most with that path when you go into something sort of just exploring the unknown, not really sure exactly where you're going to end up, but you have some things, some key things in your life and your value system that you were following, but you didn't exactly know? I mean, did you end up on food right away, or was it kind of a windy path to get to doing something with food and food systems?
A bit windy. I was interested in soil health, why certain parts of our country were depleted. There was an aspect of that too that made me curious. My children, both being adult at the time, their encouragement of looking at some of these issues with climate change. So it naturally led me to what we were doing to the land and how it played a role in climate change. So that's really where my heart landed. And I looked at different types of technology that people were using for making fertilizers. And that's really how I ended up with the technology that we have today at NetZero, and that we have taken 4 years to really research and design and be able to place it within the food system for food waste recovery, which is super exciting. And the technology originally was used for human and cattle waste, which clearly wasn't my interest. Might have been curious, but I wasn't going to end up doing that. So I decided to take that kind of technology and put it into the food waste that I was looking at, and ended up in food manufacturing plants because of the amount. I was intrigued by the sheer volumes of food waste coming out of manufacturing that literally was going right to the land, either land applied or in landfills, and it was disturbing.
When you talk about the volume of waste, of byproduct from these large manufacturing companies, and then you combine that with this technology that you saw or that you were aware of, that you were working with, was there anything like that available currently, or is that why a lot of this stuff wasn't being processed, why this stuff was being wasted? What's out there right now that can handle something like that, or 5 years ago?
Well, the history of food manufacturing and land application, if we want to stay there, the theory was that if you have tons and tons of some sort of byproduct food waste, whether it's eggshells or some portion of a food product, that just leaving it on the land was okay. And obviously that is not what we have found to be the case. But unfortunately, years of doing this way, they didn't like it, but they didn't really have any other solutions. And when you're talking about tons a day, there aren't solutions. Let's just go try this. It's a little more complicated than that. So I understood their situations. There's also a lot of regulatory that I didn't think was being imposed that should be. And I knew actually, and so did they, when I started the research, that was changing. So clearly our soil health is a direct consequence of what they had been doing. And then obviously policy changes coming down the pike. So there was a unique situation for them to let folks in my sphere come in and talk to them. They were curious what kind of technology existed. There was a lot of anaerobic digestion. There was a lot of biofuel creation. At the end of the day, those technologies, even on a commercial composting perspective, when you're talking about volumes in tons a day, those current solutions really weren't sustainable, be it financially, or otherwise. So it was really a situation where they were looking for something that they could, possibly be part of. And here I am with this machine. And we knew early on, the team knew that we would be building it to scale those amounts. We weren't interested in doing a handful from a food manufacturing plant to make a cookie. We were interested in the entire amount. And that came from their side too. They would say, I love it. It's a great idea. Taking it, processing it, putting back into the food supply chain made sense, whether that's animal or human. At the end of the day, I have 20 tons a day. I would want you to take 20 tons a day away. And that's understandable.
This obviously seems to be a growing problem for these food manufacturing companies because what they've been doing in the past clearly isn't working and or is getting more expensive. Is that a problem that you're seeing? I mean, is this something that, in addition to the climate change and the environmental impacts of it, I think you talked about regulatory. Are there regulatory pressures on these companies not to throw it in landfills anymore, but to do something different with it? And is that what's driving some of this for these companies, where it's just getting cost prohibitive, or actually they just can't even do it anymore?
Correct. So as a consumer, if you think about waste and recycling and separation. So if we go to a restaurant or grocery store, we start having to put food in one bin, plastic in one bin, cardboard in one bin, and you look at it and go, oh my God, I don't know what to do. I feel like they were in the same situation that, okay, I can't put it on this farm, but I can put it on this farm. I can't go to this landfill, but I can go to one in a different state. It's just not, it became really confusing and continues to be confusing today because we're all aware that our systems can't take this waste the way we were putting it into the system previously. So they're looking literally for answers. There isn't a lot of regulation that is even providing any sort of direction. So even on water recovery, we all know water is important, and water is part of food waste, so it's a big portion of it. And they're literally saying, where is the direction? What solutions are there? And there is no direction as far as coming from the government. It's just do something different or else you'll get fined. And that's just really not the right way to do it either.
Tell me a little bit about NetZero. What are you doing, or what have you done to date with some of this in this area of processing these byproducts, and what are you finding?
Well, one thing that we did early on is that we did not want to provide just a widget to take their waste and do something different with it. What we really wanted to do is take a more of a consultative approach, an integrated solution approach, because of the sheer volumes, and then of course the regulatory coming down and having a future perspective on it. So we take it as, hey, we're going to come in, we're going to look at what you currently do. Sometimes NetZero's platform applies and sometimes it may not. But the idea is that we come in and share the technologies that we see outside of even NetZero's technology. And perhaps there is something that can help or they can start discovery on. And then, take a look at that byproduct and really take a broad brush and say, what is left? Is it protein? Is it fiber? Is there some sort of minerals or vitamins left in this byproduct? And then go out to our sphere and see if there's people looking for those kinds of nutrients. So we took an approach more on nutrient level than we did on waste. Early on, we got rid of the word waste. We hated that word. It was like, don't ever say that. It's a bad word in our team because it's all valuable. It's just a matter of finding a place for it.
So is that sort of the goal? I mean, the name says it all. NetZero, ideally, we don't want to waste anything. Is that part of what you're looking at when you meet with a company or look at a problem, is to try to figure out how you can take every part of the process and do something with it, including like water and or byproducts?
Right, exactly. So maybe that started with looking at human and animal poop because you really had to get creative about the value of that. So anything that we came into contact with after that, boy, we were going to find some value in that. And to be honest, there really hasn't been a stream of byproduct waste that we've looked at and said there's absolutely no value. Most of if you take a look at the beverage industry and their juices and your milks, almond, oat, hemp milk, all of those come from a nut or a seed, and the precious part of a nut is usually the skin. There's lots of fiber and proteins left in those skins. So we knew right away that anything that was left from manufacturing on a byproduct, we looked at it and said, let's just assume there's value on everything. And when you're looking at taking those and supplementing and putting them into food where they belong, you can actually end up with a food product that is much better for us from a health perspective. So we had, some very strong interest from some bigger companies early on to understand ingredients and nutritional, functional nutrients. And we have some great people in that food science business that said, oh yeah, you're onto something. We've seen as consumers calcium be put into milk and these other kinds of vitamins. So this isn't new. It's just new coming from what we would perceive as waste.
So it looks like you're really, with the way you approach this, looking at it from all sides. In other words, working with a large food manufacturing company, let's just say, to help them solve the problem of what they perceive as a waste problem. And you're actually taking that and trying to find the value in it in a way that has an economic impact as well as an environmental impact, and you might say a nutritional impact, because now you take this byproduct, it sounds like, let's just use almonds and almond skins, for instance, you mentioned that, where you can not only save it from going to the landfills, but you could process it and recover the nutrients out of that almond skin and then figure out what to do with that. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So, a lot of people look at me and say, oh, are you nonprofit? Because it sounds like such great work. It must be nonprofit work. I'll tell you, no, it's very much driven on economics. And so when I looked at these things that had such high values, whether it's the protein or the fiber in some of those skins, I saw economics. I saw a food revolution that could provide jobs as well as health. So my mind, I've worked on both sides all the time, and I knew that this was going to provide something so revolutionary that it could give the food system a whole new level of power in a more just and equitable way, and then ultimately better for the environment. It was so simple in my mind. Now I understand I'm a visionary, and for most people that's not as easy to see. But it doesn't take that much convincing once you show them somehow these dots connect. I can honestly say I've never had a no, don't come visit. we have calls. We've never called anyone. They call us. They find out about it and want us to come, and they're proud of their byproducts now. It's like, we have something we know you're going to like, and we 99.9% of them do like it. And the only reason we wouldn't like it is, and this is our first question, is how safe is it today? If you don't have a way of keeping it safe, then I can't put it back into the food supply chain. I can't take something you've already put in a dumpster, process it, and make it food again. There are people who collect food that is no longer safe and do composting and make biofuels and that type of thing. But NetZero is very focused on, can the stream, if it's not safe right now, can we make some behavior change to make sure it continues to be safe, so that when we continue processing, it's an automatic process? Because otherwise you're just really not going to be able to overcome some of that regulation on the FDA side and USDA side.
Can you give me an example of that? Maybe something that you've worked with, or I know we interviewed Turner Wyatt with the Upcycled Food Association on our last episode, and he was using the brewing industry as an example, and just kind of how they go through the brewing process and have this spent grain that a lot of it is going, as you said, into a dumpster, and then maybe a farmer comes and picks it up for their pigs or something like that. How would you do what you're talking about? What would the behavior change look like in that particular example, or some other example if you have one?
Sure. I love the brewing industry, and I love craft beer, and I also have grown to love whiskey. So if you want to stay in that vein, I think we could take a look at distilling, because it's becoming more prevalent for consumers as well. So if you have whiskey, you're going to have a certain product that's used, and it's going to be a grain of some sort. So in most cases, it might be rye. And what they're going to do is they're going to do some sort of preliminary grinding, and then they're going to use it for distilling. So it's prior to fermentation, so there's not an alcohol concern. It's just they're taking all of that carb out of that grain, and then they're done with it. So from my perspective, if you look at any kind of craft brewery, which is why I love what we're doing right now, is focusing on the craft itself, the distilling and brewery craft. And it's a very important word because they're sourcing the grain from sustainable organic sources, artisan grain farmers who are just, I can't tell you how much they need support right now, and so that's another conversation. So they're being sourced on purpose because they want that whiskey or that beer to be the best it can be for their customers. So you have this beautiful grain, and to me, it made sense to go there first because that would be the grain that we should eat again. And people believed that and said, yes, if it's organic rye, sustainably grown, and it's from Farmer Dave in Minnesota, of course, we should use it again. So then the question is, well, what do you mean use it again? So the distilling process, a whiskey needs the sugar, and what's left is the fiber and the protein, and an amazing taste. As a lot of us know who love rye, it's just from a palate perspective is a great source for any kind of cooking or baking. So we went to those right away because we can always go to big, huge distilleries that might use a grain that's not as valuable as some of these craft and artisans are using. So now we can process that, and people are more than willing to pay a really good price for the protein and fiber coming from these particular artisan grain farmers.
So paint the picture for us a little bit about what that process looks like, what the behavior change actually is in this brewing process. So you get this organic rye that comes into the distillery. They do their thing with it. And then normally it would get put out into a dumpster and picked up or something. Where do you get it? How do you intercept that? And then what do you do with it once you have it?
Sure. So currently, if you went into a brewery or distillery, you might see a silo in the back. When they're done distilling or brewing, they might have enough that they put it in and might be able to invest in some sort of silo system. So they're pumping it up and it sits in a silo. And then what happens is a commercial farmer will come and pick it up, maybe once or twice a week, depending on the volumes. Then the commercial farmer or transportation company then brings it to farmers. So the problem with it is it's highly microbial. It's wet. It's going to start degradation immediately, and it's going to start smelling. So you really don't have more than a day before it's rotten. And so we can't eat as humans. animals, it gets to a point where they can't eat it. And so what ends up happening when you follow that piece of grain along, you end up finding out it ends up getting thrown away anyway, or a big portion of it. So that's a problem. There's a better way to do it. And so we looked at that too, because we do not want to exclude the farmers. We want to help the farmers. There is enough grain. If you look at your craft brewery, just your medium-sized craft brewery might have 5,000 pounds a week of the spent grain. That's enough for pigs. It's enough for humans. So there's no reason why we can't do this behavior change, have it done so that even the farmers can continue. So that being said, what does that look like? That really looks like having as much equipment on site as possible to fit right into their line. Because again, time is of the essence. It comes out, it sits there, it can't sit there for more than a couple hours. It has to continue to be processed. So in our world, if somebody has 10,000, 15,000 pounds a week, a nice sized brewery or distillery, they should look at having their own platform, their own NetZero equipment on site. If they don't, we are currently working on a more of a centralized processing facility that would enable 5 to 8 to 10 smaller craft breweries and distilleries to go into, and then from there processed and then distributed out accordingly. So those are things we're still working out. It's a much easier solution for a big, huge brewing company to put this in line. And yeah, absolutely, we work with those types of folks and we'll do that. But at the end of the day, I think it's most important to help the smaller artisan ones first on a locally basis.
Once you get this, you intercept it before it goes into the trash or into the farmer's truck, and you process it. What do you have? What comes out of this processing machine or process that you do with it, and where does it go next? How does it get back into our food?
So if you can picture going into the NetZero platform is a really heavy oatmeal mush material. Mm-hmm. And then what we do is we get the water out. There's different means of doing that on some pre-treatment equipment. And then once it has a certain moisture level, it will go into our mechanical process, which is a heat and sanitization step. So in addition to completely drying it to 90% dry, which is shelf stability, and it can sit on the shelf for unlimited amounts of time without burning it, it also has a process to kill the pathogens. So if there was anything remotely not good for us, it's not going to make it through that process. It will be completely food safe and secure. At that point, it looks just like it did going in. You could, in all intensive purposes, looks like grain, is grain, except for it doesn't have the sugar. And then from there, what we have found with the rye out of Tattersall, which is a local distillery here, is they've coarse grinded it already, so you can take it and put it right on top of your oatmeal. It's like a bulgur wheat material. And then we also would further it on to milling, and we use a stone miller here locally for that because, again, that's a really high-quality grain. And then you have your flour.
I believe on your website, NetZero.us, you have a video that sort of explains that process. And the one that I saw was on the brewer's spent grain in particular. So what we'll do is we'll put that up in the show notes so people can either go to your website or they can go to the Too Good to Waste podcast site. And under episode number 2 in the show notes, we'll have that video there on just the process that you explained. I think it's a 3 or 4 minute video and kind of walks them through from start to finish, all the way from the brewing process and on into the flour. So I think that's very important because the next part of that is, as a consumer, taking this down to our level, what would we look for? What does that look like to us as somebody who wants to support this, understands the concept, and just wants to eat something? I mean, so you have this flour or you have this stuff that you put on oatmeal. What are some of the other things that can be done with this once you have it in this new form?
Well, today it's not out as much as we would like it to be for the consumers to access the products. Having a trade association, Upcycled Food Association, and their foundation has been wonderful because there's a handful of us doing this. It's just really hard to do it on your own. And that's going to really help in this next year. The biggest thing, of course, would be to get it into big food manufacturing, consumer goods companies. So CPG, consumer product goods, are really where we'll see it You can think of crackers and cereal and any kind of products that chips, and you can find a little bit of it today, but you'd have to really source hard and know about UFA, the association, know about some of us as upcyclers to find it. But someday the vision is that these big, huge companies that currently supply us with all these chips and crackers and cereals would be sourcing it as an ingredient versus getting those ingredients from a new crop. So instead of going out and growing vegetables for vegetable protein, why would they not source upcycled ingredients? So that's been the big question this past year is wondering what has to happen for those big companies to not only say that they're interested, but to actually put it in their products. And so that's where we are today. As an industry, we are part of all kinds of different associations where those folks belong as well, educating them at the same time as educating the consumer.
So as you educate me as a consumer, what's something I could do to help support this?
That is a great question. And the number one thing you can do is start asking about your food. We are in a situation now with COVID-19, I like to think about silver linings, and I think this is one, where people are starting to say, wait, wow, food isn't endless. Wow, I'm having a hard time getting certain food at the grocery store. Wow, where does it come from? I guess I didn't realize that it comes from, a certain part of the country or the world, or, ask questions. Where does the food come from? And then ask, when it's manufactured, what happens? What happens to make oat milk? And where do the oats come from? What happens while you're making it? And then when you're done making the milk, what happens with what you didn't use? These questions will enable the big companies to realize that they're going to actually have to start sourcing it. They're going to have to put it into the food. They don't do anything until they see that consumers demand it. So it starts with the questions.
Those are great questions, and that absolutely echoes what Turner Wyatt was talking about too. And I think that's a message that we will continue to share and push and encourage everybody who hears this and goes into their stores and their co-ops and their farmers markets to do is just that, is to ask those questions. I want to go back to something you said which caught my attention, because obviously I've been around this enough to understand it, to hear some of the concerns that get raised. You talked about asking about where the products come from, so that makes me think about the farmers. And you said if these large manufacturing companies could start using some of this upcycled ingredient in their goods, in the products that they're creating, then that wouldn't require them to use as much of the initial source. So that sounds great. But then in this economic world, I was wondering about the farmer. Is there a concern? I can see somebody saying, well, but wait a minute, then what's going to happen to the farmers if they're not growing as much? Mm-hmm. What's the answer to that?
I had that concern going into this a few years back as well, because clearly I'm coming from a farming family in Midwest, and so I understand how it might look like somebody's going to be excluded here. But what I realized early on was if you take a big company that's making Doritos or something, and they're using wheat. So they're buying large quantities of wheat or corn from a farmer. That farmer is not the farmer that I want to protect. That is a commercial farm that is growing low-grade grain that is, quite honestly, not good for us. So whether it's GMO'd or all kinds of things that are happening in our food system that aren't good, the farmers we want to grow our food are the ones that are being left out, the ones that are doing work, regenerative agriculture work, biodiversity, growing organic where they can and when they can, doing it sustainable with Mother Nature and the soil health in mind. These are the farmers that we're talking about. These are the farmers we need to help. And when you take a look at them and say, your grain will be used again so that you can grow what you want to grow next year, which might be kamut or quinoa or something else they want to try. There's so many things that consumers have asked and want, there's demand for. It's just hard to get a farmer to grow for various reasons, and a lot of times it's economics. So how do we support the farmer? We support the farmers that are doing the right thing, the right way, that care, and then we give that further life and support them so that they can do the best on the land.
Is there any kind of an organization or association that represents or works with the farmers to get this message back so that you have the buy-in and the support and that the farmers understand how this can be a win for them as well? Who out there is helping communicate that message to them so we can keep all of this going and the message keeps spreading?
Yeah, that is part of my job that I love. And I had no idea when I got into this how many coalitions, how many groups on the ground there are to support local farmers. And until you get on the ground, literally in these small towns, meeting these people, you realize how much passion and love there is for farming and how much support they give each other and everybody, really. And so for me to go around the Midwest and connect with these groups, honestly, is why I keep going every day. And particularly with the grain and the brewers and the distillery is an organization in the Midwest called the Artisan Grain Collaborative. And there's groups like this all over the country. So anything having to do with grain at all, whether you're the grain farmer or you're a brewery or distillery or you're a baker or you're NetZero, this collaborative keeps everybody connected, shares information, whether that's, anything on regenerative agriculture, anything with the state and, federal government, so policy work, and then they distribute it to these people on the ground. And I just find them like families. It's just really wonderful.
It's good to know that, as you say, getting the message out, we as consumers can do that part. It's fascinating to find out how within the industry, and it sounds like with the Upcycled Food Association and with Refed and with the Artisan Grain Collaborative, all these other organizations are all starting to sing off the same sheet, basically, to get this message out. And I think that's how this momentum will continue. I want to touch on something that I've heard you say and have you explain it to us a little bit more, which is, what if the end of the food supply chain could be the beginning of a new food revolution? Okay, I think that's one of your quotes. Tell me about that. What does that mean? Help me understand that.
So again, if you visualize the entire food supply chain, so when I say wonder if the end of the food supply chain, as any particular entity or person perceives it, was actually the beginning of a new food revolution. So I want to say individual or entity perceives it because the food supply chain has all these stops along the way. So if you're a farmer, and this is devastating, and it will happen this year as well, and my heart breaks, is that some of their food that they took so much time and effort and love to grow will go to waste. And that's because farmers markets were unclear as to how this food is going to be distributed with COVID-19. They're all aware that there'll be a greater portion this year wasted. That breaks my heart. So there's one stop there. How do we eliminate that? How do we make sure nothing goes to waste? And then you go to the next person who is a producer or a brewery or someone who's doing something with that crop. And then there is waste there too. It's just part of their process, like with NetZero and byproduct processing. So that's a stop, and there could be a new revolution there. And then it goes to the store or some sort of food service where they're taking it and putting it into packages, and they're making these salads and they don't get eaten. So now not only the salad, but the package. What can we do from a technology and a whole new way of looking at that to make a new revolution at that stop? And then it's the restaurants, and then it's us as consumers in our refrigerator. What can we do at each stop where we perceive that as the end, as a new beginning?
Yeah, I love that. And it's, in some ways, it seems a bit daunting as just an individual, but yet in other ways, it's, you could just pick one thing. I guess we could each pick one thing. And I think the most powerful thing for us as consumers is just to be conscious of what we are buying, what we're consuming, as you said, to ask the questions about where does it come from, how is it made, and what I'm hearing too, and I think with what's going on with COVID-19, and I totally agree with you. We've got a very active farmers market here in the Twin Cities. I know most every other city in the U.S. has farmers markets. And right now, they've all stopped. And so hopefully there can be some kind of a solution. But again, I think a key is probably just asking the questions, and getting in touch with some of the local farmers to find out what they're doing and how can we best support them. Maybe there'll be some innovation where people start delivering it on bikes when things start coming out of this. But, that's the devastating part of this current crisis that's going on, but also, like you say, look for a silver lining and see if through ingenuity and resilience and creativity, we could all find something that would help take what might be the end of that food supply chain where these farmers grow stuff and they bring it to the farmers markets and now they can't. What is another way that they could get that produce to us? So I encourage all of you listeners to be looking for that in your own communities. Let's shift gears for a second. I want to do something a little bit fun and talk baking for a minute. So you talked about this, it got me interested in this rye from the distilling process that you've now taken and processed and ground into a flour at a stone miller, at a local organic stone miller. You end up with this flour. What are some of the things you've made and how do they taste? What have you been experiencing?
Yeah, that part's been so fun. I've always enjoyed cooking and baking, so that was a natural. I have a business to run, so I have to stay somewhat focused. So we do have a recipe developer. She's delightful. I find any of the younger generation, it's not hard to convince them that this is fun. I've had so much support out of the University of Minnesota as well as St. Thomas University of younger people just wanting to be part. So whether it's baking or cooking or sharing, it's been endless. They've made things, anything you can, pancakes, scones, muffins, anything you can possibly imagine, and it tastes good. Now it's a little different to work with because you don't have the carbs. You can't put 100% Tattersall whiskey rye and make a muffin. There would be no sugar enough to make a consistent, dense product of any sort. So it has to be integrated in. And we've been now making flour mixes so that it's more, you can just take it and anyone can use it as a regular flour that has it already integrated in. That's a little easier for most people that aren't pastry cooks and chefs to literally get right into it. Make pancakes, make anything that they've currently made, breads, and they can have at it. So since COVID, that's what we decided to do, is make it super easy. Not sell them a bag of spent grain rye that they have to figure out how to integrate into a recipe, but literally give them the bag. It says, put the wet ingredients in and make pancakes. Here's a flour. You can use it as you would any other of your flour to make your bread. And then we have a local source of organic whole wheat flour that we're mixing these things with. So they love it. They love the idea that it's local bakery flour. They know where the farmers are. They're locally sourced. And we are just took this opportunity to continue to educate and raise awareness in a very simple way so many more people can access it.
It sounds like, from what you're saying, I wouldn't necessarily get a bag of pure spent grain flour, spent rye flour. That's 100% upcycled ingredient and just bake with that, right? What would, just ballpark, what kind of a ratio would you use? Again, depending on what we're trying to make, but just to get a feel for how you would incorporate that into your baking.
Yeah, so our recipe developer, Amy Gilbert's been wonderful. So she's made enough things to say that 20% spent grain and 80% regular flour will pretty much get you anywhere. And then from there, you can start playing with it and adding a little more. We have some local chefs and bakers that are really diving in and raising it to 30, seeing if they can get more out of it. And again, that whole idea would be that a percentage of this has been recycled and now is being reused. The story is so strong that you want to continue to see how you can incorporate more and more, because it makes it sort of a challenge and a lot of fun.
You talk about chefs. I know you just had an event not too long ago, and we can also post that video on the show notes. Tell me about that. It was called appropriately the Too Good to Waste Chefs Competition. Describe that. What was that experience like?
That was a lot of fun too, and I would encourage the listeners to, they all probably have their favorite farm-to-table restaurants and these folks that do local sourcing, and so I would encourage you to ask them, again, ask questions, ask them how they feel about food waste. I've never heard anyone, as far as a chef or a baker yet, that says, oh, that doesn't make any sense. That they love it. They've been doing it, chances are, but not really telling people. They love to use every single bit of the food. And so it wasn't hard to get people to want to participate. It was harder to pick the ones because we wanted to show people a diverse menu from, not just baked goods, but how do you use it to make polenta or pasta. So we were looking at more in the innovation side and who could come up with something that we haven't even tried. And that was what the fun was. We had spätzle with rye and meat where they not that I supplied the meat, but they used different parts of the meat to make a type of a high-end little hot dog with a brioche around it with our rye flour. So the things they came up with were just fabulous. So make sure you watch the video. It was a lot of fun. You'll see close-up shots and people commenting on how wonderful it was.
And where was this held? Whose rye was this?
This was Tattersall's Rye, and they have a great venue for events. And so we got to hold it at the Clover Club, and people got to have a cocktail, of course. You're going to want to have a cocktail when you are eating upcycled rye. I'm very excited to work with their corn. Their corn is organic too, that they have in their vodka. So you can get organic vodka under the Tattersall label, which is hard to get. So if you're a vodka drinker, please look for that. But their corn is unbelievable. So we'll be processing more of that in the next few months.
And you also mentioned, so that's distilling, Tattersall Distilling, and you talked about brewing and the brewing process. Are there a handful of breweries that you've also worked with? Have you been doing brewers spent grain too? And what's their receptivity and interest in this?
The brewers were first. We went to the breweries first, and mostly because the brewing process itself is a little less complicated than distilling. So distilling is much more of a chemistry process, and brewing, you got home brewers. I'm sure everybody has a friend or someone they know that has tried home brewing. So we went to brewers first, and again, they were so cooperative. And again, they have a problem. They don't have commercial farmers. They don't have enough of the spent grain that they have the attention some of the large breweries have that solution is there. It's not the best solution, but they have one. So we went early on, Invictus, Hammerheart, Oedipals was wonderful. They sponsored our pilot project a couple of years ago, and they really were all in and said, yeah, our grain is great. And that's what's so fun is, and they're right, they all have their recipes. They all pick different types of grains, and they make these special release beers, and they're right. It ends up really, really great. It makes great products. And so that really was where we knew we were onto something. And I had a lot of people early on say, yeah, but that's not going to be consistent, so a big company can't buy that from you. But what we have found is the sustainability story, the story of local artisan, whether it's breweries, distilleries, or bakeries, consumers want it. So even the big companies are starting to go, well, wait, actually, we want to have Hammerheart spent grain in our product. And every month, we'll have a new release of a new food product featuring the special release of that brewery's beer. So that was a shock, and that was exciting, and it continues to be exciting. And we're hoping that after this COVID thing settles down, that we can get back to those exciting conversations.
So as you talk about beer, the thing that goes well with beer that I keep thinking about is pretzels. Has anybody tried pretzels?
Oh, yeah. We even have a pretzel food truck. So that went over really big early on. Pretzels and beer, you're right. And so when people are sitting there going, wow, I could have a pretzel that actually has the spent grain from the brewery where my beer is coming from, they love it. In fact, it's been a big hit. It's hard to make a soft pretzel, and it's hard to keep it warm. So that's more of a food truck type solution. The next thing we're on to is, of course, making a hard pretzel. We have a couple people researching that now to make and commercialize hard pretzels out of spent grain.
Well, I have personally tasted some of those spent grain pretzels, and I have to say, I absolutely love them. Really, really neat. It's cool to see what people are doing with the spent grain flour and how that's creating a new fun product that goes great with beer, by the way. And we'll keep our eyes open. I really want to try those hard pretzels too. So if you are a pretzel lover, by all means, look around, start asking around, and the more people ask for it, the more likely you are to find them someday, hopefully really soon. So I wanted to shift gears for just a minute, Sue. I know how hard you have worked at building NetZero, and not just the business, but the movement, what it stands for, and how you really want to integrate this concept of upcycling food and reducing food waste into everything that you do. And through all of that hard work, I have to believe, and I would hope that there are a couple of shining moments that stand out for you here and there. And I wonder if you could share one of those with us.
I would say in the last couple days, in the midst of what we are experiencing together as a global crisis and a food system crisis upon us, the one thing that I realized is that this movement of caring, of understanding, and looking at it as a wide problem, that's still there. In fact, I feel a sense of a battle that people are just not going to give up. In fact, someone said this morning, the people who have had the courage to jump in the arena and do upcycling or any kind of a food system disruption are still in the arena as of this morning. And someone said, I'm so moved by it that those of us who have been in it are not going to give up. In fact, it's going to come out, it's tipped. Let's just say, I have that idea of a tipping point. What I realized is before COVID, it actually had tipped. And so we don't have to be scared that all of our work didn't go very far. I believe we're going to come out and it's just going to explode. And we are going to look at this new revolution that's upon us on the food supply chain. We are going to make a difference for the next generation. We are going to make the difference for farmers and for Mother Nature and our soil health. It's not going to be easy, but we're not giving up.
Well, you've got my full support, and I'm sure everybody who's listening to this will want to do whatever they can to help support it. And talked a little bit about that, asking questions. Is there anything else you can think of that we as individuals can do to help support that?
I would have everyone consider sharing this podcast, any other information you find out there on upcycling or anything along with diverting and distributing food differently. Once the food is distributed differently, we'll start to see healing. So jump in and ask where you can help. There are so many things locally at the farmers markets. There are connections to the local food groups that can use all the help that you can offer. And donations too. Upcycled Food Association's taking donations. There's a lot of food shelves that really need your help right now. And the less food waste there is, the less these people were used to getting some of this stuff out of grocery stores. And if you can imagine going to a grocery store now and there's no produce left because we're out of food, who's not getting fed are these people who were getting those things previous to COVID. So there is a lot of different organizations that are trying really hard to feed people. So look them up and give.
Absolutely. I definitely want to echo that. I see it all the time, these amazing organizations that are really adapting and adjusting to what's going on with COVID and still really working hard to try to get the food, the good quality food, to the people who want it, who need it, who are looking for it. So by all means, keep looking in your community and do whatever you can to help continue to support that. So now for anybody who wants to learn more about what you're doing at NetZero, where would they go to get some information?
Yes, you can come to the website, NetZero.us. Happy to hear from you. And if you want to see where you can buy the flour and the pancake mix, go ahead and go on the website and ask.
All right. Sounds good. And you're also on social, I believe, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. You can follow you on all of those. And we'll have the links in the show notes for all of that. Anything else you would like to say? I think we've covered an awful lot.
Start baking at home. It's fun. I guarantee.
That's a great idea. By the way, for the listeners, do you have a recipe, a spent grain recipe that we could put on the show notes that you'd like to share? Maybe Amy has one or something?
Yes, I'm happy to have Amy post some recipes, ones that even I can do. So we'll keep it real simple. But absolutely, now is the time to really get your whole family involved in food and cooking and baking. It's not, COVID-19 will pass. So while we're in this situation, let's just have some fun at home.
I think that's a great idea. Sheltering in place, baking in place.
Yes.
All right, then I'll look for my favorite recipe and we'll get the ingredients together and we'll try to figure out something. Sue, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on this episode.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that wraps up episode number 2 of the Too Good to Waste podcast series. This one with Sue Marshall of NetZero. We hope you found it interesting and we're glad you joined us. Check out the show notes. We're going to have all kinds of good information, some fun videos and links to everybody that was mentioned in this particular episode. You can help us out by liking us wherever you listen to your podcast. 5 stars would be absolutely amazing. We would greatly appreciate that. And also sharing it with anybody you think might be interested in this topic. Also, you can follow us on Instagram. Give us a shout. You'll find us at TooGoodToWaste_podcast. Special thanks go out to Sue Marshall, a.k.a. my wife, for helping with the creative development on this podcast series, and to our production assistant, Amy Gilbert, who helps with writing, researching, and is our resident upcycled food baker. And of course, to our sponsors, NetZero. You can find them at NetZero.us and the Upcycled Food Association at upcycledfood.org.
Too good to waste. Absolutely.